Hey, I am happy to see many of you following along as we read The Biology of Kundalini by Jana Dixon and discuss. So I'm going to jump in with die-offs today. We're on page 97 if you're following along. Remember, you can also read at lulu.com for free. And you can cross-reference any of these terms to other places in the book, or if you hear me mention a quote, you can find that. Okay, die-offs. So yesterday we were talking about ego death and existential escapism. That was an interesting time. She was talking about the act of separation of the conditioned self is what accumulates negative karma. But when we awaken, we're like going through this metamorphosis, so we push out all of this old programming, right? So we get to this die-off. And she's quoting from John 12:24, "Unless a grain of wheat falls into the earth and dies, it remains alone. But if it dies, it bears much fruit." Interesting. And then from Uniting Sex, Self and Spirit by Jana Polly Haddon, she quotes, "When we deny the urge toward transformative death, it can only manifest covertly through unconscious projection." So, in other words, the transformation does happen, the metamorphosis does happen. We can either be mature about it and lean into it, or be attached to the previous self so that it's really hard, or we can go toward it. She's saying if we don't go toward it, it's going to happen anyway. It's just going to make like an unconscious projection happen. Then she quotes the gnosis-usa.com lectures on Kundalini, and that if you want to find that exact link, you have to go to page 97 under die-offs. She quotes, "Whoever has studied the history of magic knows very well that in all epochs it has been said that all great initiates remain dead for 3 days and resurrect on the 3rd day." How about that? So that's even saying for us, like we go through an intense die-off period that is a 3-day interval. "The best definitions for stages of growth in consciousness that I have found are egg, caterpillar, pupa, and butterfly. This perfectly describes the stages, implications, and profundity of metamorphosis. As well as a rebirth, we also have to start seeing metamorphosis as a process of progressive death. The caterpillar dies to its eggness, right? The pupa dies to its caterpillarness. The butterfly dies to its pupuness. My hope is to clarify that dark nights, die-offs, and difficult Kundalini symptoms and phases are not in any way karmic punishment, but simply the metamorphic alchemy at work in a completely natural, wholesome way to bring about a new, truly human species." A new, truly human. I think it's interesting she doesn't say a truly new human species, but a new, truly human species. So she lists now 4 types of down trip. Okay, there are 4 main types of down cycle events in metamorphosis that need to be clearly understood to prevent unnecessary suffering and secondary backlash. Okay, the first one is called lightning. This is a terror event of intense energy pouring up the body, similar to euphoric inner conjunction, but in this case, it is a dysphoric inner conjunction. It's the opposite. Here we seem to descend deeply into our matter and experience great fear with no apparent cause. This negative inner conjunction mostly occurs during one's first awakening, as the polar flip to the spontaneous bliss awakening in the neophyte body that is unfamiliar with such intensity of consciousness and energy. But I have to leave a side note to that, because in every single awakening that I've experienced, there is always a moment, and it can be, depending on how much you resist it, a few days, a day, an hour, a minute, weeks, where you feel the dissolve and the death portal open for you, as you could say, and you experience a great fear, like a hopelessness, an all is lost moment. That is like the breakaway from the old paradigm, actually. The second phase, she says, shock, white shock, or autonomic shock that occurs immediately after a mystic opening. Oh no, she says that occurs immediately after mystic ecstasy or sex with eros. That is the contraction and toxic overload after a significant opening to the extreme bliss of a euphoric inner conjunction event. So you have this magnificent opening, like you see the vision. This is like the common thread in all the awakenings, is you see a bigger vision. You have an aha moment. Your limitations on reality have just been blown open to a greater degree. And this is why we can have so many awakenings, because we're going from blinders to, like, maybe we see a boom, but usually we just see like a boom and that seems huge, and then we see a boom and that seems huge. If we see a boom where we get the entire picture, that's hard for our ego mind and even smaller brain to comprehend. So generally, even in psychedelic experiences, we have this, and then we come back here and we're a little bit wider than before. We're allowing some of that bleed in, but we're still not ready to like integrate all of this. So every progressive awakening, even if you get the full opening, comes back to as far as you can manage the vision, as far as you can handle knowing that much, you know. And that's, she says, the toxic response is really just the biochemicals and everything that were responsible for holding this vision. When they blow open and contract again, all the new neurons that you need to hold this awareness, they're replacing something. So that's the toxic die-off. It's only toxic because we're in a different state of mind now. Self-digestion is the third part. This is a difficult one, I find. And I sometimes feel like I literally am digesting myself. Like I'm getting smaller, I'm getting thinner during that time, living off less food generally during a die-off. And then you'll go again to like this very nourishing time. But they are catabolic breakdowns of the former structure. So we can sometimes assist that through fasts and so forth ahead of time, but sometimes we're just forced into it through apoptosis due to oxidation by free radicals, and then phagocytes by the macrophages. So literally there's cells eating other cells, right? Especially those that have been oxidized, those are going to come and get cleaned up. Then she says the burnout. Lastly, there's an exhaustion phase. I think this is such an important phase too. An exhaustion phase of the overall awakening cycle, when the body's resources of neurotransmitters, hormones, and nutrients have been used up in the climb to the height of awakening peak. And during the exhaustion, yes, depression can arise, but there is almost like a bliss in it, an ability to behold it as you go through this again and again. She says there's a permanent bliss giving the sense of being dissociated from the depression. So it's an exhaustion, there's a heaviness, but there's also an awareness that wasn't there before. The four types of down cycle could variously be associated with what the mystics call the dark night of the soul. They are unavoidable, as the living death must occur for resurrection of the spiritual body-mind. All must enter the dark night, perhaps many times during the cyclical process of evolution. He who is not born twice will not ascend into the kingdom of heaven. The deeper one goes into a die-off, the greater the resurrection. Similarly, more one allows the influx of spiritual phase during the heart expansion, the deeper one does go into the die-off. So there is this extreme. So if you get really like this amazing wow, you're going to go even deeper than if you just were like, huh, wow, amazing. The die-off is either acute or chronic, depending on the person and the phase of awakening. It happens after the influx of spirit as the flesh transmutes. There is a die-off of the conventional conditioned structures. For every influx of spirit, there's an accompanying catabolic breakdown of the former pupal body or die-off. Only those people that have the kundi flowing up the spine and the experience of extreme bliss, influx, or massive opening events are going to die off. Die-offs are distinct periods of catabolic breakdown in which there's no operative ego other than that which is sufficient to drag one to the bathroom when appropriate. So this is where you're not feeling good, you're down, you're sloughing off, either you're feeling sick, you're purging, maybe you're vomiting, you have diarrhea, you're sick, or you're just super, super down emotionally and you're sleeping and you're resting. This is indicative of a catabolic breakdown, this die-off that she's talking about. And it's important because it takes your ego out and you're just like, I know, I'm a mess. And you're no longer resisting, right? By the die-offs, I'm not meaning a near-death experience. It feels more like a bacterial infection is consuming one's body, right? You feel sick, but there's no bacterial type symptoms or smells. A die-off is mostly blissful, but there are points it can be extreme pain as well. There's hyper-awareness of all the damaged parts of the body. It's like the damaged parts are being eaten. That's a good way to describe it. There is slight nausea, but it's mostly a case of not being able to get out of bed for 3 or more days. All one can do is make it to the bathroom and drink water. This is the body bottoming out, so it's not a highly conscious condition. One doesn't get subtle level insights during this time. The mind's in a mild, like hallucination state, not available for normal egoic function. There is maybe internal music playing, or voices, or sounds, or lights, coupled with just this sense of grace, like you have to do this, you're just going through this. It's kind of a no mind state, right? When the die-off's over, we actually feel a new lease on life. And that's why, like, don't resist the process, even though it's a bummer sometimes. Like, don't try to keep plowing through, just let yourself. It's much more so than a simple recovery from an illness. In the degree of holiness of experience, I've found that a die-off is the runner-up to the inner conjunction, mainly because it is a cessation of doing and the enforced relinquishment of the dominance of the ego. Eventually, this is willingly chosen because any division between body, mind, soul becomes increasingly obvious and painful. My intuition is the ego cannot handle love, and in actuality, ego loves fear. Eventually, this is penetrated and seen as self-defeating. For the love we give is the love we are, and the love we are is that which can receive from others. Die-offs can be acute when you're in bed for 3 to 6 days, or chronic, what I call the walking die-off, where you can still get around, but you have this distinct sense of being eaten from the inside out. I've totally had that experience. During my 2 awakenings, she's saying I had several walking die-offs and 3 acute die-offs. The first of my dark nights was the implosion event several weeks after my spontaneous awakening in December 1988, which we read about earlier. This peak of the down cycle was one night of extreme panic, she says, electrical and energetically intense as the blissful spontaneous awakening had been. So she's describing the down cycle as blissfully spontaneous or intense as the blissful spontaneous, energetically intense. So the intensity level is the same. Similarly, the energy was pouring up my spine, threatening to blow my head off, so she felt. But I was in abject terror, not bliss. This dark night was accompanied by a walking die-off, where there was an extended period of catabolic breakdown of the body via the immune system, but I was not forced into bed rest. Then she describes her second die-off a month after attending the Alex Gray workshop. If you remember, she talked about that in November 1999, and he has incredible images, as I mentioned before. You can just stand in front when he had the display. It was full body size images of the whole body system and the spiritual mechanics of the body, and you could just stand there and feel and notice, and he depicts the Kundalini, the life force. It was accompanied by, so she says it was a 4-day somatic collapse after going to this Alex Gray thing, and more emotional than electrical, and mostly spent in bed. Probably she felt dead. It was accompanied by intense grounding, fatigue, and heart expansion. The third was November 2000, after 3 months of the main influx of fire and heart expansion after being in my initiator's presence. And this was atomic and cellular, an almost complete collapse of normal faculties for 6 days, she says. The sensation of the body eating itself was so apparent in this die-off that it was this experience that made me realize the role of the immune system in metamorphosis. Just imagine being her and like going through that experience and being like, my immune system is helping with this. Like having that part of her become aware. That's really sweet. Ego is suspended during this time. There's mild hallucinations of voice and image, often blissful, a holy sensation, sometimes incredibly painful, as the transmutation is working on particularly congested or damaged parts of the body. For me, this was the right side of my face and head. Oh man, I've definitely had that, which felt as though it was being dissolved by acid for a day. So I've also extreme pain in the hip, and I'm pointing to my left right now because I have had the other side, but I've had this side too. Seems to me that after experiences of radical expansion and extreme euphoria, we tend to compare the difference between where we were in mystic revelry and the condition most of us live in. It is then that extreme cathartic anguish occurs as we mourn the sorry state of our collective human condition. And this is part of the heart expansion, because you really, when you tap into that, it's profound, right? An extremely cathartic anguish. Yeah. This is one of the hyperbolic curves that occurs during the first stage of alchemy, especially if the realization is around one's family situation, which can make it really hard too. After a time, I suppose our compassion takes on a lighter air as our physicality loses its dross and heavy nature, and our faith becomes unconditional, i.e. detached from worldly appearances. So it is the cleansing fire of Kundalini that helps to clear out the heaviness, the dross of the association with the heaviness of the world, to be in the world but not of the world, that kind of thing. And it can be very emotional. It can be very emotional to release that. And part of that is just, one is extreme identification, like really thinking that this world is me. But also knowing it too, because in the oneness, the God self, this is a possibility of creation that we are experiencing as ourselves in this thing. And yet, so that can be painful. Like, wow, to be able to feel this level of pain and disconnection. Holy cow. Like, to really, really feel that. And that actually feels better to experience it as the God self than as the singular human self. That can be a lot more emotional because you can feel a lot more alone, right? So saying compassion allows you a lightness. The evolution of faith probably goes from blind faith to informed faith to unconditional faith. But it's doubtful that any of us can proceed in this development without periods of the obscuring or loss of faith. For we have to die to our former stage of faith to move on to the next. Boy, I can say I'm in one of those right now. And that's rough. Like, I'm more aware than last time I went through this complete annihilation of my previous belief structures, and it felt like a loss of faith. But then I regrouped that. Like, as I integrated the new information, then my faith was stronger than ever and in a totally new way. And so this time I'm aware, and this will maybe be the third major time in my life that a huge disillusionment with a certain layer of realities going on, and I've experienced recently that loss of faith feeling, like what I had faith in does not hold the same for me anymore, because now I've been exposed to a greater reality than that. And until you are where you are, and that's perfect. Like, you can only take in what you can take in. So I'm aware that on the other side of this, as I integrate, that's something great to look forward to. As I go through like a sort of soul death again, a death of a reality, and it's just as she describes. I was going to say subscribe if you haven't. That each time we go through it, like, we realize this is the process of becoming. Like, this is the journey. If you're just beginning on this journey, this is the journey. Like, it's a metamorphosis of eternal proportion. And we will become the master shapeshifters in a very conscious, beautiful way. But first we must learn the process so we can co-participate. And I'm realizing I'm getting close to the hour as I'm recording this, and I do have a session coming up. So let me just close this down. Usually what brought us to this impasse is the pull of the heart and psychic intuition and profound spiritual illuminations. So to be plunged into a space where we can no longer rely on our conditioning, the spiritual illumination seems to have left us an extended period of dark night. She says it's about 5 years to recover that extreme chemistry, and yeah, I would say so. I mean, my last major one of these that I just spoke of was my son was 1, who's now 15. That was 14 years ago that I had a major one, and the one before that. Gosh, they seem similar distance apart. So about 5 years to recover the chemistry of the peak. Yeah, I don't know how to speak to that. I feel like it was longer for me. But then the recoveries also go in waves. So you feel like you recover, and then later you're going through something where you realize it's another layer of that thing that happened a really long time ago. This is the period in which spiritual practice, sangha, and listening to spirit for understanding, meaning, and direction is most important. We feel a sense of loss during the exhaustion phase, when we have lost our magic. That is so true. And extrasensory abilities, and are temporarily more mortal than we were prior to our awakening. We all have to come down. It definitely feels that way. The loss feels like losing oneself, one's lover, one's muse, one's God. The difference is shocking. And if we do not do the work to reduce ourselves, then life feels like it's not worth living. What was given to us so abundantly by grace must now be won by discipline, hard work, and character development. That is, I'm going to end on that line because I have it underlined in red too, and I think it's so important. Because a lot of people say, when they have their Kundalini awakening and then they crash and die off and they feel like, oh, it wasn't worth it anymore. Like, why can't I have that experience again? They're looking for that experience to be gifted to them again. But that was the experience to motivate you to find the way there yourself. And that's how I look at entheogens, plant medicines. Plant medicines were some of my first awakening moments. And then after experiencing awakening like that a few times, I realized, oh, that's a place I can get myself to. And that began my journey of yoga. That was part of my journey of healing and all of that. So if you need assistance with that, please feel free to reach out, leave a comment below if you have a question about anything. We'll end there today with the biology of Kundalini. We're on page 99. That's great. So tomorrow we'll start on page 100. And I hope you'll come back and join me again. Thank you for being here on this channel. I hope you'll share this with somebody that you feel like it will help. And I hope it's helping you. And we'll see you next time. Much love.